Picture this: deep in the stone-walled scriptoriums of medieval monasteries, by the flickering light of candle and torch, monks bent over parchment with quills in hand, not just copying sacred texts, but hiding them. Their mission: to safeguard knowledge from rulers who sought to control what could be read, shared, or even thought. These weren't just scribes, they were cryptographers, rebels of the written word who devised astonishingly clever ways to encode messages right under the noses of censors. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on 25 of their most ingenious secret language systems, codes so subtle, so brilliantly disguised, that they allowed forbidden ideas to survive centuries of suppression. What makes these systems so remarkable isn't just their complexity, it's the sheer audacity behind them. Imagine weaving hidden meanings into the strokes of illuminated letters, or crafting entire alphabets that looked like mere decoration to the untrained eye. Some monks even invented languages that could only be decoded by aligning layers of parchment or reading between the lines literally. These weren't just tricks, they were acts of quiet defiance, a testament to the lengths humans will go to protect truth when power tries to silence it. And here's the thing, these ancient techniques didn't just vanish. The same principles monks used to cloak their words in secrecy echo in the digital encryption that protects our emails, our bank transactions, even our private messages today. So why does this matter now? Because the struggle between secrecy and censorship, between knowledge and control, is as old as writing itself. By unraveling these monastic codes, we're not just uncovering historical curiosities, we're tracing the roots of a battle that still shapes our world. Over the next minutes, you'll witness how devotion and deception intertwine to preserve ideas that might otherwise have been lost forever. From symbols hidden in plain sight to ciphers that required mathematical genius to crack, each of these 25 systems reveals a chapter in humanity's relentless pursuit of intellectual freedom. Ready to step into the shadows, let's begin where the monks did, with a blank page, a sharp mind, and a determination to outwit the watchers at the gate. The medieval world was a battleground of ideas where the written word held immense power and danger. Religious and political rulers knew that controlling knowledge meant controlling minds, so they imposed strict censorship on anything that challenged official doctrine. Monasteries, once seen as quiet sanctuaries for prayer and study, found themselves under intense scrutiny. Any text deemed heretical, whether it questioned church authority, explored forbidden philosophies, or preserved banned scientific theories, could mean exile, imprisonment, or worse for the monks who dared to copy or share it. But here's where the story takes a fascinating turn. Instead of surrendering to censorship, these scribes turned their scriptoriums into workshops of deception. They became masters of disguise, embedding rebellious ideas in plain sight. Some techniques were elegantly simple, like swapping words with innocent-sounding synonyms. A biblical parable might secretly critique corrupt rulers if you knew which terms to decode. Others were staggeringly complex, like crafting entire fake manuscripts where the real message was hidden in the spacing of letters, the pattern of ink stains, or even the illustrations themselves. One particularly bold method involved writing between the lines literally. By using invisible inks made from citrus juice or milk, monks could pen forbidden thoughts that only appeared when heated over a flame. What's truly remarkable is how these methods evolved alongside the tightening grip of authority. As censors grew more sophisticated, so did the monks' countermeasures. They didn't just hide messages, they weaponized aesthetics, turning lavish, illuminated manuscripts into Trojan horses. A decorative border might contain a cipher when read counterclockwise, or a saint's halo could double as a coded diagram. The very artistry meant to honor sacred texts became a shield for subversion. This wasn't just about preserving knowledge, it was a high-stakes game of intellectual cat and mouse, where creativity was the ultimate survival tool. And the stakes couldn't have been higher. In an era where a single controversial book could lead to a monastery's destruction, these secret languages weren't just clever tricks, they were lifelines. They allowed thinkers like Roger Bacon, whose radical scientific writings threatened the establishment, to share ideas without immediate detection. They kept alive texts that would later fuel the Renaissance, proving that even the most oppressive systems couldn't stamp out curiosity forever. Every coded manuscript was a quiet act of defiance, a whisper passed through the centuries reminding us that the human mind refuses to be shackled. The Caesar Shift Cipher might sound like something from a spy novel, but its roots stretch back over 2,000 years, long before monks put their own twist on it. Originally credited to Julius Caesar, who used it to scramble military messages, this deceptively simple system became a lifeline for medieval scribes determined to outsmart censors. Here's how it worked. Every letter in a word was shifted a set number of places down the alphabet. A shift of 3, for example, would turn an A into a D, a B into an E, and so on. To anyone unaware of the key, the encoded text looked like gibberish, but to a monk holding the secret, a forbidden theological argument or a critique of corruption could hide in plain sight, disguised as an innocuous prayer or inventory list. What made the Caesar Shift so brilliant wasn't just its simplicity, it was its adaptability. Monks could customize the shift number, creating unique keys for different communities or texts. A manuscript smuggled from France to Germany might use a shift of 4, while one circulating locally shifted by 7. This flexibility made it incredibly difficult for authorities to crack every coded message, even if they intercepted them. And while the cipher seems rudimentary today, it was remarkably effective in an era when literacy was rare, and most censors lacked the patience or mathematical savvy to unravel the pattern. The real genius, though, lay in how monks weaponized the ordinary. Imagine a cathedral ledger listing donations of grain and wine. To a suspicious abbot or king's inspector, it was just a mundane record. But with the right shift applied, those seemingly random words could reveal a scathing critique of the church's wealth or coordinates to a hidden cache of banned texts. This blending of the mundane and the subversive turned everyday documents into potent tools of resistance. And here's where the story gets even more fascinating. The Caesar Shift didn't just protect ideas, it shaped them. By forcing monks to think algorithmically, the cipher became a gateway to more complex encryption methods. Some scribes began layering shifts, creating double encoded messages where letters were shifted first by 3, then by 5, exponentially increasing the difficulty of decryption. Others combined the cipher with symbolic imagery so that even if someone cracked the code, they'd still need to interpret the metaphors woven into the text. This interplay of math and artistry laid the groundwork for modern cryptography, proving that a tool invented for war could become a shield for peace, or at least for intellectual survival. Yet the cipher's greatest legacy might be its psychological impact. Every time a monk encoded a message, they were engaging in an act of quiet rebellion, a reminder that knowledge could never be fully contained. Even when authorities burned books or imprisoned scholars, the Caesar Shift ensured that ideas could slip through the cracks, disguised as something too ordinary to notice. It's a lesson that resonates today, in an age where encryption still guards our most private thoughts from prying eyes. The monks didn't just preserve texts, they proved that creativity, not brute force, is the ultimate weapon against censorship. While the Caesar Shift relied on mathematical patterns to cloak forbidden words, another ingenious system turned the very art of manuscript decoration into a stealthy medium for rebellion. Enter symbolic marginalia, those whimsical doodles and fantastical creatures that dance along the edges of medieval pages. At first glance, they seem like playful distractions, the medieval equivalent of scribbling in a notebook during a long sermon. But look closer, and you'll discover these so-called decorations were anything but innocent. Monks transformed margins into minefields of hidden meaning, where every twisted vine and grinning gargoyle could carry a coded punch. Take the humble snail, for example. In one 14th century manuscript, a series of snails appear to be racing across the bottom of a page, a humorous sight, until you realize they're positioned beneath an official church decree. To initiate, the slow-moving creatures symbolize the clergy's corruption. Their shells a sly critique of how the church carried its wealth at the expense of spiritual progress. Even more daring were the babuins, those bizarre hybrid creatures part human, part animal that leer from the edges of sacred texts. A fox dressed as a bishop might mock ecclesiastical hypocrisy, while a donkey playing a harp could lampoon the hollow performance of religious rituals. What made Marginalia so effective was its camouflage in plain sight. Censors focused on the main text, dismissing margins as decorative flourishes. This blind spot gave monks extraordinary freedom to experiment. Some wove entire acrostic poems into border designs, where the first letters of Latin phrases hidden in foliage spelled out banned ideas. Others used color symbolism. A red flower might represent martyrdom, while a black bird could signal impending persecution. The more absurd the imagery appeared, the safer it was. Authorities were far less likely to interrogate a drawing of a knight fighting a giant lobster than a suspiciously worded psalm. But Marginalia wasn't just about mockery or concealment. It was a sophisticated visual language. Consider the green man, a face made of leaves that pops up in manuscripts across Europe. To most, he was just a decorative motif, but to dissenting monks, his mouth spewing vines symbolized the unstoppable spread of forbidden knowledge, roots creeping into cracks of orthodoxy. Even the placement of these images held meaning. A critic tucked into the lower margin might represent suppressed voices, while figures reaching across pages could signify clandestine networks passing ideas hand to hand. The survival of these coded drawings reveals a profound truth about censorship. It often overlooks what it deems beneath notice. While authorities burned books and hunted heretics, they allowed subversive art to flourish in the margins literally. Today, these doodles remind us that resistance doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers from the edges, hidden in laughter, or disguised as something too trivial to censor. The monks who inked these rebellious whimsies knew something we'd do well to remember. The most dangerous ideas are often the ones that make power look the other way. Among the most visually striking of the monks' secret languages was the Pigpen Cipher, a system so intuitive yet so impenetrable that it bridged the gap between art and encryption. Picture a series of grids, each divided like the wooden fences of a pigpen, with dots marking specific sections. Every letter of the alphabet was assigned a unique angular symbol formed by these lines and dots, transforming words into a constellation of geometric shapes. To the untrained eye, a page of Pigpen code might resemble architectural sketches or abstract ornamentation, perfect camouflage in an era when manuscripts overflowed with intricate designs. What made this cipher extraordinary wasn't just its clever design, it was its accessibility. Unlike complex mathematical codes that required scholarly training, the Pigpen could be mastered by anyone who could draw its grids. A monk could scribble the key once in the corner of a parchment, memorize it, and then destroy the evidence, leaving no trace for censors to find. The symbols themselves were deliberately ambiguous. A single shape might represent different letters depending on its orientation or the presence of a dot, adding layers of misdirection. A seemingly innocent sketch of interlocking squares in a manuscript's margin could, in reality, hold coordinates to a hidden library or names of sympathetic scholars willing to shelter banned texts. The cipher's endurance speaks to its versatility. By the 12th century, variations of the Pigpen appeared in monasteries from Spain to Bohemia, each adapting the grid to local needs. Some versions used crosses instead of squares to further blend with religious iconography, while others incorporated colors, red dots for vowels, blue for consonants, creating an additional visual code layer. Its influence even spilled beyond ecclesiastical walls. Centuries later, Freemasons adopted a nearly identical system, proving how effectively medieval monks had solved a timeless problem: how to share secrets in plain sight. But perhaps the most ingenious aspect of the Pigpen was its psychological deception. Authorities scrutinizing manuscripts tended to focus on words, not shapes. A page filled with angular symbols might be dismissed as mere doodling, especially if nestled among legitimate geometric diagrams common in theological texts. This bias toward the familiar gave monks a potent advantage. They could encode entire paragraphs condemning corruption or detailing forbidden astronomical theories, knowing the very simplicity of the cipher, its resemblance to children's puzzles, would divert suspicion. Today, the Pigpen's legacy lingers not just in history books, but in the DNA of modern cryptography. Its core principle, using visual patterns to obscure meaning, echoes in everything from QR codes to capture tests. The monks who refined it understood something fundamental. The best hiding places aren't always dark corners. Sometimes they're right in the light, disguised as something too ordinary, too harmless to warrant a second glance. And in that simplicity lay their revolution. Music wasn't just worship for these monks, it was a weapon. Hidden in the soaring melodies of Gregorian chants, buried in the rise and fall of sacred harmonies, lay an entirely new kind of secret language, musical cryptography. Imagine standing in a candlelit chapel, surrounded by voices chanting in unison, completely unaware that the very notes vibrating through the air carried coded messages of rebellion. This was stealth communication at its most sublime, where censorship couldn't penetrate because the medium itself was untouchable. The system was elegant in its simplicity. Monks assigned each letter of the alphabet to a specific pitch or sequence of notes, transforming words into melodies. A hymn about divine light might secretly spell out the location of a hidden manuscript when sung in a particular key. More sophisticated versions used melodic motifs as triggers. A specific 5-note pattern could signal that the next verse contained an encrypted message, while the rest of the chant served as camouflage. Some choirmasters even composed entire masses where the intervals between notes corresponded to letters, allowing forbidden texts to be sung aloud under the guise of devotion. What made this method so revolutionary was its audacious publicness. Unlike ciphers hidden in manuscripts, musical codes thrived in the open. Authorities might confiscate books or monitor scribes, but who would dare silence a choir singing praises to God? This was cryptography disguised as piety, where the act of worship became the perfect cover for dissent. A single sustained note could mark the beginning of a hidden passage, while an unusual cadence might alert initiates to listen closely for meaning beneath the melody. Even the pauses between phrases could carry significance. A rest of 3 beats instead of 2 might separate coded sections from innocent ones. The creativity didn't stop there. Some monasteries developed key chants, are specific melodies that, when hummed or played on an organ, unlocked the cipher for accompanying texts. A visiting monk might hear a familiar tune during Vespers and instantly know which hymn book contained encrypted messages. Others used polyphony as a tool, layering multiple vocal lines where only one carried the true meaning, the rest serving as decoys. The most daring systems even incorporated hand signals during performances. A raised finger or turned palm could indicate when to transpose notes or switch cipher keys mid-chant. This fusion of music and mathematics reveals an astonishing truth. The monks didn't just evade censorship, they weaponized beauty against it. Where brute force might fail, a perfectly pitched alto voice could slip ideas past the gatekeepers of orthodoxy. The very grandeur of sacred music, its emotional power and cultural sanctity, became the ultimate shield for subversion. Centuries before digital encryption, these medieval cryptographers proved that sometimes the safest way to hide a message is to let it soar into the open air, disguised as something too beautiful to suspect. The book cipher turned sacred texts into something far more powerful than spiritual guides. They became living vaults of hidden knowledge. Imagine a monk copying what appears to be a routine commentary on the Book of Psalms. To outsiders, every reference to Psalm 23, line 4, or Proverbs 15, line 7, seems like devout scholarship. But to those holding the key, these citations unlock a parallel text, a radical reinterpretation of scripture, or even coordinates to a cache of banned philosophical works. This was encryption at its most elegant. No suspicious symbols, no altered letters, just the veneer of orthodox study masking a shadow library of forbidden ideas. What made the system so formidable was its perfect camouflage. In an era where quoting scripture was both common and encouraged, censors had no reason to scrutinize citations. A suspicious abbot might confiscate a scribe's original notes, but who would question a monk for referencing an approved Bible passage? The real message existed only in the spaces between the specific combinations and sequences of verses that, when read together, formed entirely new meanings. One surviving example from a French monastery shows how it worked. A seemingly dry list of psalms actually pointed to letters hidden within those verses, spelling out a scathing critique of the church's land acquisitions. Another used the numerical values of referenced verse numbers to encode dates for secret meetings. The book cipher also fostered a unique kind of intellectual brotherhood. Unlike memorized passwords or complex symbols, this system required initiates to share not just a key, but an intimate familiarity with the source text. A monk in Bavaria could send a coded letter to a colleague in Flanders, confident that both would interpret Matthew 6, line 19, the same way, perhaps as a veiled warning about approaching inspectors. This shared literacy created networks of trust that transcended borders, turning the Bible itself into a clandestine communication network. Yet the cipher's brilliance lay in its adaptability. While most used scripture, some monasteries repurposed other common texts, liturgical calendars, saints' biographies, even farming almanacs as keys. A Benedictine monk might hide a message about forbidden astronomical theories within references to a harvest manual, knowing fellow scholars would recognize the cipher's source. Others layered deception by using multiple books, one for page numbers, another for line references, making decryption impossible without both volumes. Perhaps the most daring application was in smuggling controversial interpretations of scripture itself. A monk could write an apparently orthodox sermon, while the cited verses subtly undermined church doctrine when read in a specific order. To the untrained eye, it was piety; to initiates, it was revolution. This duality allowed reformist ideas to spread under the guise of tradition. proving that sometimes the safest place to hide subversion is within the very text's authority holds sacred. The book Cipher's legacy endures in modern encryption, where one-time pads and shared keys mirror its principles. But beyond technique, it reminds us of a profound truth. Knowledge survives not just by being hidden, but by being woven into the fabric of the ordinary. When every reference to a familiar text might carry secret weight, censorship becomes impossible, because to destroy the key is to destroy the very canon power seeks to protect. The monks didn't just encode messages, they turned the written word into a hall of mirrors, where the line between devotion and defiance lay in how you read between the lines. Invisible ink, the stuff of childhood spy games, became a lifeline for monks navigating the razor's edge between secrecy and survival. While modern minds might picture complex chemical formulas, these medieval cryptographers turned to the humblest of tools: lemon juice, milk, even their own urine. Dabbed onto quills and painstakingly inscribed between the lines of sanctioned texts, these liquids dried clear, leaving behind messages invisible to all but those who knew how to reveal them. A warm candle flame held beneath the parchment would work like magic, the heat coaxing the hidden words into sudden, legible darkness. To a censor flipping through a hymnal or theological treatise, the page appeared pristine. But to a fellow initiate, a warning about an impending raid, coordinates to a hidden cellar, or fragments of forbidden Aristotle translations might emerge like ghosts from the vellum. The brilliance of this method lay in its audacious simplicity. Unlike ciphers requiring memorized keys or complex decoding, invisible ink needed no explanation, only a heat source and a moment of privacy. A monk could pass a seemingly blank scrap of parchment to a trusted colleague, knowing the message would self-destruct after reading, leaving no physical evidence behind. This made it ideal for urgent communications, like alerting neighboring monasteries to approaching inspectors or confirming the safe arrival of smuggled texts. Some scribes even layered techniques, writing innocuous notes in visible ink while hiding the real message between the lines, creating a dual-text masterpiece of deception. But the true innovation was in the materials themselves. By using substances readily available in any monastery kitchen or garden, monks ensured their methods left no procurement trail. A jar of lemon juice or a pitcher of milk raised no eyebrows, unlike rare pigments or imported chemicals that might attract suspicion. The inks were also deliberately ephemeral. Once cooled, the words often faded again, sometimes vanishing entirely after a few revelations. This built-in obsolescence turned each message into a fleeting whisper, ensuring secrets couldn't be extracted from captured parchments. The risks, however, were as real as the flames used to reveal the words. A single slip, a telltale warping of the parchment from uneven heating, an overeager novice holding the flame too long and scorching the page could betray the system instantly. Some monks developed countermeasures, like pre-treating parchment with alum to make heat reactions more subtle, or using diluted inks that required precise heating angles to appear. Others worked in teams, with one scribe penning the visible text and another adding the hidden message later, so no single person knew both layers of meaning unless absolutely necessary. What's often overlooked is how this technique blurred the line between science and art. Monks weren't just applying lemon juice, they were pioneering early chemistry, experimenting with concentrations and additives to perfect their invisible inks. Some discovered that adding a pinch of salt to milk made the writing darker when heated, while others found that certain types of vinegar produced less warping than citrus. This trial-and-error process transformed scriptoriums into makeshift laboratories, where the quest for knowledge and the need for secrecy drove innovation in equal measure. The legacy of these disappearing inks stretches far beyond monastery walls. Centuries later, revolutionaries from the American colonies to Cold War-era dissidents would use nearly identical methods to pass clandestine messages. But it was the monks who first proved that sometimes the most powerful way to hide something isn't to lock it away, but to let it vanish in plain sight, waiting, patient as prayer, for the right moment to reappear. Poetry became a Trojan horse in the hands of these cunning monks, where the beauty of meter and rhyme concealed blades of dissent. The acrostic code transformed sacred verses into linguistic puzzles, where the real message wasn't in the lines but in their edges. Take a hymn to Saint Benedict, its opening letters spelling out a forbidden word when read downward. What appeared to be devotion was actually defiance, woven so subtly that even the most vigilant censor might overlook the pattern while scrutinizing every syllable of the surface text. This technique's power lay in its elegant duality. A single manuscript could serve two audiences simultaneously, one reading horizontally for orthodox meaning, the other vertically for hidden truth. Some acrostics were blunt, spelling out names of persecuted thinkers or locations of secret debates. Others were more nuanced, like a 12th century Easter sequence where the first letters of each stanza quietly inverted the church's official stance on predestination. The more lyrical and elaborate the surface poem, the more effective the camouflage. Censors were far less likely to dismantle a beautifully crafted prayer than a dry theological treatise. What made acrostics particularly insidious was their adaptability. Unlike ciphers requiring special keys or tools, anyone could create or decode them with basic literacy. A monk under house arrest might compose an apparently penitent psalm, its acrostic secretly assuring his allies he hadn't recanted. Others used nested systems where every third line formed one acrostic, while the full text contained another, creating layers of meaning accessible only to initiates. The most daring examples even played with language itself. Latin acrostics that translated to vernacular protest when read vertically, allowing illiterate peasants to grasp the message when recited aloud by sympathetic clergy. The genius of this method wasn't just concealment, it was psychological warfare. By embedding criticism within approved texts, monks turned censorship's tools against itself. Authorities couldn't purge acrostic-riddled manuscripts without destroying legitimate scripture, creating a paradox where protecting orthodoxy meant preserving heresy. Some inquisitors grew so paranoid they banned all poetic forms with regular line lengths, inadvertently stifling liturgical creativity in their hunt for hidden messages. Yet the acrostic's greatest legacy might be its influence beyond the cloister. Centuries later, revolutionaries from the American colonies to Nazi-occupied Europe would use the same technique to smuggle messages in plain sight. The monks who perfected it understood something profound, that the straightest lines, whether in poetry or protest, often conceal the sharpest rebellions. Their acrostics weren't just codes, they were literary landmines, buried in beauty and detonating only for those who knew where to look. The grid cipher turned parchment into a puzzle where only the right key revealed the hidden picture. Imagine a monk composing what appears to be a mundane letter about monastery, supplies barrels of wine, sacks of grain, requests for fresh ink. To any prying eye, it's utterly innocuous. But when an identical sheet of parchment with precisely cut holes is laid over the text, certain words align with the openings, forming a secret message. Avoid the western gate, or Aristotle's text buried beneath the yew tree. This was the cardan grill in action, a system so brilliantly straightforward that it required no mathematical skill, just two pieces of parchment perfectly synchronized. What set this method apart was its flawless deniability. Unlike ciphers that left telltale patterns of odd symbols or rearranged letters, A grill-encoded message showed no outward signs of manipulation. Even if authorities intercepted the letter, they'd find only plausible, disjointed phrases about daily monastic life. The real genius lay in the grill's disposability. After decoding the message, the recipient could burn the overlay, leaving no physical evidence of the system's existence. Some monks took this further by designing grills that doubled as bookmarks or devotional artwork, ensuring they'd never look out of place if discovered. The technique's adaptability made it indispensable. A single grill could be reused for multiple letters by rotating it 90 degrees, creating 4 potential cipher orientations from one template. Others incorporated offset patterns where every third word in a paragraph was part of the hidden message, turning lengthy correspondence into a literary minefield of concealed meaning. The most sophisticated versions even used layered grills, one to select words, another to indicate which letters within those words held additional coded numbers or dates. But the grill's true mastery was psychological. It exploited the censor's own assumptions about how secrets traveled. Authorities expected coded letters to contain odd phrasing or symbols, not mundane lists of supplies. By hiding in the utterly ordinary, monks turned boredom into a weapon. A grill-encoded letter could pass through multiple inspections because its surface text was genuinely unimportant, the equivalent of hiding a key in a locksmith shop. This method's legacy endured far beyond the Middle Ages. Variations of the cardan grill reappeared in the American Revolution, World War I espionage, and even early computer encryption. Yet its roots always trace back to those monastic scribes who first understood. Sometimes the strongest lock isn't a complex mechanism, but a simple shape that makes the invisible visible, but only to those who know where to look. Numbers became the perfect disguise in monasteries where mathematics and divinity walked hand in hand. Numerological substitution turned sacred equations into secret alphabets, where a column of figures that appeared to tally monastery expenses might actually spell out a heretic's name or the location of a banned text. This system didn't just hide messages, it weaponized the medieval mind's reverence for numbers, cloaking rebellion in the unimpeachable language of divine order. Take the simple act of numbering parchment pages. To most observers, folio 7, line 12, was just archival notation, but to monks using the =1 cipher, those same digits could point to the 7th letter of the alphabet G and the 12th L, forming the clandestine abbreviation for the Gnostic Gospels. Even biblical verse counts, ubiquitous in monastic writing, could double as code. A scribe referencing John 3:16 might genuinely be discussing salvation, or they might be signaling the 16th letter P in the 3rd chapter's text, marking a buried philosophical treatise under the priory's pear tree. The brilliance of this system lay in its dual appeal. For pious scholars, numbers carried cosmic significance: 3 for the Trinity, 7 for creation, 12 for apostolic perfection. By encoding messages within numerical patterns, monks could argue they were merely honoring sacred mathematics if questioned. But for those fluent in the cipher, every digit held a second layer of meaning. A monastery's inventory of 42 candles, 70 loaves, 12 fish might conceal a warning that 42 equaled the letters D and B danger brewing, while 12 signaled the month of December when inspectors would arrive. Some monasteries elevated this to high art by combining numerology with other encryption methods. A German Benedictine manuscript survives where every 10th letter of a mathematical treatise on prime numbers actually spells out a condemnation of the Church's sale of indulgences. Others used Fibonacci sequences as keys, the spacing between coded letters following the golden ratio, ensuring only mathematically trained initiates could decode them. This fusion of scholarship and subterfuge created an intellectual arms race. As church authorities grew suspicious of number patterns, monks responded by making their ciphers mirror legitimate theological calculations about biblical chronology or astrological events. Perhaps the most daring application was in preserving scientific knowledge. When the Church condemned certain astronomical theories as heretical, numerological codes allowed monks to embed celestial computations within approved texts. A table calculating Easter dates might secretly chart planetary movements using letter equivalents, turning liturgical tools into smuggled science. This numerical doublespeak became so pervasive that some inquisitors began scrutinizing even legitimate mathematics, an unintended consequence that ironically slowed genuine scholarship while the coded messages kept flowing. The legacy of these numerical ciphers echoes in modern encryption, where alphanumeric substitution remains foundational. But beyond technique, they reveal a profound truth about knowledge under siege. When words become dangerous, numbers can become their lifeline. The monks who hid letters behind digits understood that even the strictest censorship rarely questions the language of accounting, of scripture, of the stars themselves. In a world where faith and reason were supposed to be inseparable, they found the perfect loophole by making rebellion look like reverence and dissent sound like devotion. The mirror script turned writing into a kind of alchemy, where words only revealed their true form through reflection, like secrets whispered into a pool of mercury. While Leonardo da Vinci famously employed this backward writing in his notebooks, medieval monks had been perfecting the art for centuries, transforming their journals into optical illusions. Imagine a scribe hunched over his parchment, carefully inking each letter in reverse, not just from right to left, but with individual characters flipped as if viewed in a looking glass. To anyone glancing over his shoulder, the page would appear as meaningless scribbles, the strokes defying all familiar shapes. But hold that same parchment up to a polished bronze mirror, and suddenly, the chaos resolved into crisp Latin condemning the corruption of local bishops. This method's elegance lay in its dual defenses. First, it exploited the brain's hardwired expectations. Our minds are trained to recognize letters in specific orientations. Flipped and reversed, they trigger confusion rather than comprehension. Even literate inspectors would dismiss mirrored text as random marks or shaky penmanship. Second, it required no additional tools beyond a reflective surface, something readily available in monasteries where polished metal mirrors were used for both personal grooming and scientific experiments. A monk could decode a message using a ceremonial chalice, a shield's embossed surface, or even a still pool of water in the cloister garden. The mirror script's greatest strength, though, was its intimacy. Unlike ciphers designed for mass communication, this was a language of personal rebellion. Marginal notes in forbidden texts, private diaries criticizing abbots, or annotations on controversial scientific theories could all be shielded from casual discovery. One surviving example from a Swiss monastery shows a psalter with mirrored glosses praising pagan astronomy comments that would have meant expulsion if written conventionally. Another reveals a cookbook where reversed recipes for ink and pigments actually encoded instructions for making invisible ink, hidden in plain sight among instructions for monastery meals. But mastering this script demanded extraordinary discipline. Writing backward required not just reversed letters, but inverted spatial reasoning, every stroke planned in mirror image, every word constructed from end to beginning. Some monks trained by tracing letters on wax tablets while watching their hands in mirrors, building muscle memory for the unnatural motion. Others developed hybrid systems, writing only certain sensitive words backward while the rest of the text remained normal, creating sudden ruptures in readability that further confused outsiders. The technique's legacy endures in unexpected places. modern neurologists study mirror writing to understand brain lateralization, while artists use it as a meditation on perception. But its most poignant lesson comes from those monastic scribes. Sometimes the clearest way to hide truth is to show it, just not the way the world expects to see. In the choreographed rituals of medieval worship, every bowed head and raised hand could carry a hidden meaning, if you knew where to look. The liturgical code transformed sacred ceremonies into living ciphers, where a slight deviation in the sign of the cross or an extra beat in a chant's rhythm might signal danger to those initiated into the system. Picture a Benedictine monk lifting his fingers during the Eucharist, not to bless the congregation, but to indicate that church spies had infiltrated the monastery grounds. Or imagine a choir subtly elongating the final syllable of the Agnus Dei, alerting fellow brothers that forbidden texts had been safely relocated beneath the chapel floor. These weren't just acts of devotion, they were acts of deception, performed with such precision that even the most suspicious bishop might miss their true purpose. What made this system so formidable was its seamless integration into sanctioned rituals. Unlike coded manuscripts that could be confiscated or invisible inks that required heat to reveal, liturgical signals existed only in motion and sound, vanishing the moment they were performed. A hand gesture mimicking the wiping of a chalice might seem pious to observers while secretly marking which confessional booth contained smuggled letters. Some orders developed entire parallel liturgies where the placement of candles or the sequence of hymns corresponded to letters in an alphabet cipher. The most sophisticated versions even used liturgical calendars as keys. A feast day celebrated a week early could signal initiates to gather in the Scriptorium after compline. The creativity extended beyond gestures. Certain monasteries composed echo chants, harmonies where only the altos sang the true message in counterpoint, while the rest of the choir provided cover. Others repurposed the ancient Christian practice of troping, inserting extra phrases into standard prayers that sounded like pious flourishes but actually contained warnings. A seemingly spontaneous, "O Lord, guide us through this night," slipped into evening prayers might really mean, "Inspect the wine cellar tonight for hidden books." The system became so refined that some communities could conduct entire covert communications during Sunday Mass without exchanging a single written word or suspicious glance. But the true brilliance of liturgical coding lay in its psychological safety net. Accusing a monk of heresy for how he folded his hands during prayer or how he intoned "Amen" would have seemed absurd, even to zealous inquisitors. This forced authorities into a paradox. The more they scrutinized rituals for hidden meanings, the more they risked appearing sacrilegious themselves. By anchoring their codes in the most sacred, most routine aspects of worship, monks turned orthodoxy into their greatest shield. The legacy of these performative ciphers survives today in unexpected ways. Modern intelligence agencies train operatives in innocuous signaling, using everyday actions to pass messages, while religious communities in oppressive regimes still modify rituals to communicate under surveillance. The medieval monks who perfected this art understood something timeless. When words become dangerous, the body itself can become a library of secrets, and the most powerful rebellions are sometimes whispered through the motions of compliance. Rebus manuscripts turned sacred texts into visual riddles where faith and trickery shared the same page. Imagine a monk carefully illustrating a psalm, not with traditional illuminations, but with a sequence of cryptic images, a loaf of bread followed by a human ear, then a shepherd's crook. To the untrained eye, it might resemble whimsical marginalia, but to initiates, this was no doodle. It spelled out belief, bread, loaf, ear, crook in medieval French, pain, oreille, baton. This was linguistic alchemy at its finest, where pictures ceased to be mere decorations and became a silent rebellion against censorship. The brilliance of the Rebus lay in its playful deception. Unlike complex ciphers requiring mathematical skill, Rebuses relied on homophones words that sounded alike but carried different meanings. A drawing of a knight's lance next to a sun might covertly express lance solil, the French phrase for I alone think, a daring assertion of independent theology. Some monasteries developed entire visual lexicons where recurring symbols, a bee, a leaf, a key, functioned as reusable syllables in an ever-expanding secret vocabulary. The more innocent the images appeared, the more effective they were. Censors might burn a controversial treatise, but who would destroy a beautifully illustrated book of hours filled with charming pictures of animals and objects? What's striking is how these pictorial codes exploited cultural blind spots. Medieval authorities trained to scrutinize words often overlooked visual puns as mere artistic flourishes. A German abbot might confiscate a manuscript criticizing papal taxes, yet miss the same message encoded in a rebus showing a coin pfennig, plus a nesting bird hoon, plus a door tor, together sounding out fenayuntor, the local nickname for corrupt officials. This gap between textual and visual literacy gave monks a critical advantage. They could smuggle radical ideas past gatekeepers who'd never think to read a series of drawings as sentences. The system's sophistication grew with time. Some scribes layered rebuses within rebuses. A symbol representing a syllable might itself contain smaller images hinting at pronunciation. Others combined rebuses with acrostics, where the first letters of each pictured object's name spelled yet another hidden word. The most elaborate examples appeared in herbals and bestiaries, where botanical or animal illustrations served dual purposes, educating about nature while secretly transmitting banned knowledge. A page on medicinal herbs might depict rosemary alongside a sea myrrh to encode rosemary myrrh, the code name for a controversial female mystic's teachings. Today, the rebus lives on in children's puzzle books and corporate logos, but its medieval origins reveal a deeper truth about resistance. When words become dangerous, images can become their bodyguards, smuggling meaning through the back door of perception. Those monastic artists understood something timeless. Censorship often targets what it recognizes as language, while letting ambiguity slip by unnoticed. Their rebuses weren't just codes, they were camouflage, turning controversy into something as harmless and unassuming as a picture of a cat on a mat, unless you knew to listen for the whispered message in the shapes. Anagrams transformed sacred language into a playground of hidden meanings, where the letters of a saint's name might dance into scandalous new arrangements under a monk's quill. Take the Latin phrase Sanct Benedictus, rearranged with care. Its letters could slyly spell, sed nunquam tacetis, meaning but never be silent, a radical call to intellectual defiance. This wasn't mere wordplay. It was linguistic alchemy, turning orthodox phrases into vessels for forbidden ideas right under the noses of ecclesiastical inspectors. The beauty of the system lay in its dual nature. To the untrained eye, an anagrammed prayer still looked devout, its letters all present and correct. Only those who knew to dissect and reassemble the components could extract the explosive truth nested within. Some monasteries elevated this to high art by layering anagrams within anagrams. A hymn to the Virgin Mary might contain one obvious rearrangement praising her purity, while a deeper scramble of select letters revealed coordinates to a hidden cache of Gnostic texts. Others exploited the medieval fascination with numerology, crafting anagrams where the number of letters corresponded to biblical verses that, when consulted, provided keys to further decryption. One surviving manuscript from a Cistercian abbey shows a seemingly straightforward chronicle of abbots, but when certain names are anagrammed, they morph into dates and locations of secret debates on predestination. The cipher's greatest strength was its deniability. Accusing a monk of heresy for how he arranged letters in a prayer would have seemed absurd after all. Every character was technically present, just reordered. This forced censors into tedious letter-counting exercises that often yielded nothing, as clever scribes salted their anagrams with red herrings. A Benedictine in Burgundy famously wrote an entire psalm where every line could be rearranged two ways, one pious, one provocative, allowing him to prove his orthodoxy if challenged while still smuggling radical ideas to initiates. What's often overlooked is how this shaped medieval scholarship itself. The mental gymnastics required to create and solve complex anagrams honed minds for abstract thinking, indirectly fostering advances in cryptography, mathematics, and even early linguistics. Monks who spent years teasing meaning from scrambled letters developed cognitive muscles that later unlocked scientific patterns in nature or music. The anagram wasn't just a tool of secrecy, it was a treadmill for the medieval intellect, training generations to see beyond surface arrangements to deeper structures. This legacy echoes in modern puzzle culture, from newspaper anagrams to escape room challenges. But its most profound lesson lies in the monk's understanding of power's blind spots, that rigid systems often focus on what's present rather than how it's arranged. By making rebellion a matter of sequence rather than substance, they turned the very building blocks of sanctioned language into instruments of quiet revolution, one shuffled letter at a time. Wax tablets turned ephemeral words into the ultimate disappearing act, a secret language written not to last, but to vanish on command. Picture two monks passing in a shadowed cloister, one casually smoothing his finger across a wax-covered wooden tablet as if correcting an error. To any observer, it's just a scribe at work, but in that fleeting moment before the wax went blank, a warning about approaching inquisitors or the location of a hidden manuscript had already been conveyed. This was communication as transient as a breath on glass, leveraging the very fragility of wax to outmaneuver censorship. The system's genius lay in its simplicity. Unlike parchment that could be confiscated or decoded, wax tablets were ubiquitous in medieval monasteries, used for everything from accounting to drafting sermons. A message scratched into the soft surface left no permanent trace. A quick pass of a warm hand or the flat edge of a stylus erased all evidence. Some monks developed techniques to write in multiple layers, embedding deeper secrets beneath surface notes about supplies or liturgy. A casual grocery list might conceal coordinates to a safe house, readable only by tilting the tablet to catch the light before the wax was wiped clean forever. But the wax tablet's impermanence was a double-edged sword. While perfect for urgent warnings or clandestine meetings, it offered no way to preserve complex ideas across time. A monk might encode Aristotle's forbidden theories on physics, only to see them vanish with the next candle's heat. This limitation sparked ingenious adaptations. Some monasteries paired wax with memory techniques. A coded phrase on the tablet would prompt the recipient to recite a memorized passage verbatim later. Others used tablets as temporary keys, displaying cipher instructions long enough for a scribe to transcribe them onto safer media before erasing. The most daring applications turned erasure into theater. A monk under interrogation could dramatically smooth his tablet in front of accusers, destroying evidence while secretly having already passed its contents to allies. Some accounts describe entire debates conducted via wax, where each argument was written, debated, and erased in real time, leaving no paper trail but profoundly shaping underground theological discourse. What makes this method so poignant is how it reflects the precariousness of medieval dissent. Like messages in wax, whole schools of thought could vanish under pressure, surviving only in whispers and mnemonics. Yet even this fragility had power. Authorities could burn books, but how do you confiscate words that cease to exist the moment they're read? The monks who mastered wax tablet cryptography understood a radical truth. Sometimes the strongest message is the one that chooses its own moment to disappear. Hidden in the spiraling paths of prayer books and psalters lay a secret language of twists and turns the labyrinthine folio. At first glance, these intricate maze designs appeared to be devotional aids, meant to guide a monk's finger along a meditative journey toward spiritual centering. But for those who knew the true starting point, perhaps a barely perceptible dot near the third curve, or a tiny cross hidden in the border, the same path could reveal an entirely different destination, forbidden words emerging line by line as the finger traced the correct route. This was encryption disguised as contemplation, where the act of seeking God became a veil for seeking truth. The genius of these labyrinthine codes lay in their layered symbolism. Medieval Christians already associated mazes with the soul's difficult journey toward salvation, a metaphor borrowed from classical myths like Theseus and the Minotaur. By embedding messages within these sacred patterns, monks created a perfect alibi. Even if an inquisitor scrutinized the maze, its existence was defensible as pious art. But follow the sequence of right turns at specific hymn verses, or pause at every seventh intersection where the inked line thickened slightly, and a radical commentary on church authority might materialize. Some designs even exploited optical illusions, where words only became legible when viewed from an extreme angle, safe from casual observation. Physical construction of these folios required astonishing precision. A single misdrawn line could render the hidden text unreadable or, worse, make the cipher obvious. Surviving examples show monks using compasses and straightedges to create geometric mazes where the spacing between paths concealed tiny letters. One particularly elaborate manuscript from a Bavarian monastery features a labyrinth whose outer rings contain perfectly copied scripture, while the innermost spiral, reachable only by solving a series of directional clues, hides a condemnation of the Pope's military campaigns. The care invested in these designs speaks volumes. These weren't hasty concealments but masterpieces of patience, where the labor of encryption mirrored the spiritual discipline it protected. What's often overlooked is how these mazes functioned as early infosec training. Initiates weren't just given keys, they were taught to think algorithmically, to spot subtle irregularities in pattern and spacing that might indicate a message presence. Some monasteries developed entire curricula where novices practiced by solving increasingly complex labyrinths before being entrusted with real secrets. This mental conditioning created generations of monks who viewed every text as having potential hidden dimensions, training minds to see beyond the surface long before modern cryptography formalized such thinking. The labyrinth's ultimate deception was its adaptability. Unlike rigid ciphers that required specific keys, these mazes could be customized endlessly. A spiral might encode one message when read clockwise, another counterclockwise. Others used color cues, red paths for theological dissent, blue for practical warnings about raids. The most brilliant examples even incorporated time delays. Certain words only appeared if the reader spent exactly 12 minutes tracing the maze, a safeguard against hurried inspections. These manuscripts remind us that some truths aren't just hidden, they're guarded by journeys. The monks who crafted them understood that censorship often targets destinations, not paths. By making revelation a process rather than a fixed point, they ensured their most dangerous ideas could only be found by those willing to walk the long, winding road. one deliberate turn at a time. Language itself became a cloak in the hands of monks who knew the power of marginal tongues. While Latin dominated church and scholarship, countless regional dialects thrived in monastery corridors, Gaelic whispers in Irish abbeys, Occitan murmurs in southern French cloisters, Old English verses echoing through Northumbrian scriptoria. These linguistic outsiders, often suppressed by authorities promoting Latin uniformity, became unexpected allies in the fight against censorship. A Welsh monk could pen scathing critiques of Norman bishops in his native Cymric, knowing the flowing, consonant-heavy words would baffle Francophone inspectors. A Breton scribe might annotate a Latin psalter with Cornish proverbs, their meanings as opaque to outsiders as any cipher. This dialect defense worked because it exploited the medieval world's fractured language landscape. Ecclesiastical authorities prioritized controlling Latin, the language of liturgy and law, while often dismissing vernacular tongues as peasant chatter. A list of monastery supplies written in Gaelic might be filed away unread by English-speaking abbots, never realizing it actually detailed which manuscripts to hide before an inspection. Some monks took this further by inventing hybrid dialects, blending regional vocabulary with Latin grammar to create a linguistic no-man's land where only bilingual initiates could navigate. The famed Book of Deer, an illuminated Gaelic gospel from Scotland, contains marginalia that baffled scholars for centuries until someone realized the scribe had written Latin concepts using Gaelic word order, creating a grammatical maze. The system's brilliance lay in its cultural layering. Unlike numerical ciphers requiring memorized keys, dialect coding drew on something deeper, childhood language, the mother tongue whispered at hearths and sung in lullabies. A Provençal monk could switch seamlessly between flawless liturgical Latin and the Oc language of his youth, using the latter for passages he needed to hide in plain sight. This made interrogation futile even under duress. The neural pathways of native language made it nearly impossible to accidentally betray meanings to non-speakers. Some communities developed entire shadow libraries where banned texts were preserved not just in content but in form, their very words acting as cryptographic armor. Surprisingly, these linguistic sanctuaries sometimes preserved languages themselves. When Norman conquerors suppressed Old English in favor of French, monks kept the ancient tongue alive by using it for coded commentaries, effectively saving Beowulf-era vocabulary under the guise of secrecy. Similarly, Irish monks maintained pre-Christian Ogham script by repurposing its angular markings as cipher components in Latin manuscripts. The persecuted became the preservers, turning censorship's tools into instruments of cultural survival. The legacy of dialect codes resonates wherever minority languages face suppression. From Welsh poets defying English rule to Yiddish writers circumventing Tsarist censors, the strategy remains potent. When authority controls one language, truth finds refuge in another. Those medieval scribes understood that the most impenetrable cipher isn't invented, it's inherited. Flowing in the blood and bone of people told their words don't matter. By writing what power couldn't read, they proved that marginalization, like parchment, could be scraped clean and rewritten, but never truly erased. The knot script transformed humble strands of wool or hemp into silent messengers, carrying secrets in every twist and loop. While the Inca quipu system used knotted cords for record-keeping across vast empires, medieval monks adapted this tactile language for a far more dangerous purpose, smuggling forbidden knowledge under the very noses of authority. Picture a rosary dangling from a monk's belt, its beads perfectly ordinary to any observer. But between those beads, nearly invisible against dark robes, ran a slender cord with knots tied at precise intervals, each twist encoding a letter, each cluster forming words that could unravel into explosive theological arguments or warnings of impending raids. What made this system extraordinary was its marriage of simplicity and sophistication. Unlike ink that left permanent traces, knots could be swiftly untied or even swallowed if danger approached. A coded cord hidden in a sleeve or woven into a basket's rim required no special tools to read, just fingertips trained to interpret the language of tension and texture. Some monasteries developed elaborate standards, square knots for consonants, figure eights for vowels, with spacing indicating syllables. Others borrowed from maritime traditions, adapting sailors' knot-tying techniques to create messages that would baffle land-bound censors. A surviving example from a Scottish abbey uses a modified fisherman's bend to spell out Matthew 18:6, a biblical reference that doubled as coordinates to a hidden cave library. The Manuscripts' brilliance lay in its adaptability to oral culture. In monasteries where illiterate lay brothers outnumbered Latin-literate clergy, knots became a bridge between worlds. A complex theological debate could be distilled into a series of knots on a string, passed hand to hand and read aloud by those who knew the tactile alphabet. This made it ideal for communities preserving Celtic or Nordic traditions, where memorized lore was prized over written texts. One account describes Irish monks using knotted cords to teach forbidden Druidic astronomy, with each knot representing a star in constellations condemned by the Church as pagan. But the system's true innovation was its deniability. Unlike suspicious manuscripts, knotted strings had countless innocent uses, from mending habits to marking prayer cycles. A bundle of cords discovered in a monk's cell might be dismissed as sewing supplies, even as they quietly recorded the names of exiled reformers. Some scribes took this further by creating hybrid documents, Latin psalters with knotted bookmarks that, when laid alongside specific verses, revealed hidden meanings through a cipher of positions and crossings. The legacy of these knotted codes endures in unexpected ways. Modern researchers have identified similar techniques among persecuted groups from the Armenian highlands to the Appalachian Hills, proof that when words become too dangerous to write, human ingenuity will always find another way to tie truth into existence, one knot at a time. The palimpsest was the ultimate act of medieval recycling and one of history's most ingenious censorship loopholes. Picture a monk carefully scraping a blade across aged parchment, removing the ink of some forgotten sermon to make way for a new liturgical text. To the untrained eye, the sheet was blank, ready for fresh words, but under the right conditions, angled sunlight, a smear of vinegar, or centuries later, ultraviolet light, the ghost of the original writing would rise from the page like a whisper refusing to be silenced. This wasn't just thriftiness, it was textual sleight of hand where banned ideas could hide beneath the veneer of orthodoxy, waiting for the right moment to be heard again. What made palimpsests so powerful was their dual existence. On the surface, they were perfectly acceptable, a psalter copied for daily prayers, a church inventory, a saint's biography. But lurking beneath were often the very texts authorities sought to destroy. Pagan philosophies, heretical Christian commentaries, even early scientific treatises. A 13th century prayer book might conceal fragments of Archimedes' geometry, scraped away by a monk who valued the parchment but couldn't bear to obliterate the knowledge entirely. The most subversive examples layered multiple texts like a theological lasagna where each stratum told a different story, depending on which layer you knew how to read. The process itself was an art. Monks didn't just erase, they curated. Using pumice stones and acidic solutions, they removed enough ink to create a clean surface while leaving behind faint traces that could be recovered with effort. Some scribes became experts at selective erasure, obliterating only the most dangerous passages while leaving less controversial sections partly visible as decoy under texts. Others employed clever camouflage, overwriting banned texts with such similar content, say, a Gnostic gospel beneath an approved one, that the differences were subtle enough to evade notice but striking enough to signal initiates. Modern technology has turned these medieval acts of preservation into archaeological revelations. Multispectral imaging can now reconstruct texts that were invisible for centuries, peeling back layers of history like an onion. One famous case is the Archimedes palimpsest, where 10th century mathematical proofs were overwritten with prayers in the 13th century, only to be resurrected by 21st century imaging. Similarly, Syriac translations of Greek medical texts, once erased to make room for saints' lives, have been recovered, proving how monasteries acted as accidental time capsules for knowledge the Church tried to suppress. Yet the palimpsest's true genius was psychological. By embedding the forbidden within the approved, monks forced censors into an impossible choice: destroy the palimpsest and lose legitimate texts, or let it stand and risk preserving heresy. This duality made the system nearly foolproof, even when authorities suspected a manuscript might harbor hidden layers, proving it required laborious scrutiny and admitting that orthodox materials could be compromised. The palimpsest didn't just preserve words, it weaponized the very medium of writing, turning parchment into a battleground where memory and oblivion fought to a draw. Today, these overwritten manuscripts remind us that erasure is never absolute. The past lingers in the fibers of the present, waiting for the right light to make it visible again. Those medieval scribes, scraping away ink with one hand while shielding truth with the other, understood something profound. Sometimes survival isn't about resisting destruction, it's about learning to live beneath the surface. Micrography turned sacred artistry into a clandestine craft, where every flourish of the quill could whisper rebellion. Hebrew scribes had perfected the technique for centuries, crafting intricate illustrations from nearly invisible script, a tradition Christian monks adapted with startling ingenuity. Imagine an illuminated Bible where the ornate D beginning a psalm seems merely decorative at a glance, but lean closer and the swirling vines reveal themselves to be thousands of minuscule letters, each stroke a word, each curve a sentence spelling out forbidden translations of scripture or names of exiled reformers. This was secrecy woven into the very fabric of beauty, where censorship's gaze would see only devotion's handiwork. The process demanded extraordinary precision. Scribes used the finest quills, often trimming the nibs to a single hair's width to inscribe letters smaller than poppy seeds. Some manuscripts contain entire theological arguments hidden within a single capital letter, the text spiraling inward like a linguistic nautilus shell. A particularly daring example from a Swiss monastery shows the Virgin Mary's halo composed of Greek philosophy, quotes Aristotle's banned logic hiding in plain sight beneath layers of gold leaf. The technique's brilliance lay in its plausible deniability. Even under scrutiny, micrography could be dismissed as artistic excess rather than subversion. What elevated this from mere trickery to true cryptographic art was its layered deception. Many micrographic designs employed multiple scripts, Latin forming the visible outlines of an image, while Hebrew or Greek letters at near microscopic scale carried the secret message. Some scribes took this further by varying ink formulations. The decorative text might use standard iron gall ink, while the hidden content was written in subtly different compounds that aged differently over time, becoming more or less visible with centuries. A 13th century Psalter from Normandy demonstrates this perfectly. Its elaborate border now reveals condemnation of the Albigensian Crusade in faded brown lettering, while the original gold decoration still dazzles the untrained eye. The system's sophistication extended to specialized reading techniques. Certain micrographic codes could only be deciphered using polished crystal lenses or by viewing the page underwater's distorting surface methods familiar to monastic scholars studying optics but unknown to most inspectors. Others played with perspective, where tilting the parchment made certain lines of minuscule text align into legibility. A famous antiphonary from Bohemia contains musical notation that, when viewed at a 45-degree angle, resolves into an acrostic naming local heretics sheltered by the abbey. Micrography's legacy endures in unexpected places, from the microprinted security lines on modern currency to artists like Zhu Bing recreating the technique with contemporary themes. But its most profound lesson comes from those medieval scribes hunched over candlelit desks. That truth, when compressed to its essence, can hide most boldly in the open, not by shrinking from view, but by dazzling so brilliantly that none think to look closer. Timing was everything in the seasonal cipher, a system where sacred rhythms dictated secrecy's rules. Imagine a monk in December, penning what appears to be a routine Advent hymn. To inspectors, the lyrics celebrate the coming nativity, but fellow initiates know the rules have shifted with the liturgical calendar. During these 4 weeks of anticipation, every third word carries hidden weight, and the spacing between letters now corresponds to prophetic books of the Old Testament. Fast forward to Eastertide, and the same scribe's pen obeys an entirely new cipher where vowels represent psalms, and the length of each line marks chapters in forbidden commentaries. This wasn't just encryption, it was a dance with time itself, where the steps changed with the church's own seasons. The brilliance of this temporal system lay in its self-erasing complexity. Unlike static ciphers that risked exposure if their patterns were cracked, seasonal codes reset like liturgical clocks. A spy might decipher a Lenten message by painstakingly analyzing 40 days' worth of correspondence, only to find the rules had transformed overnight with the celebration of Resurrection Sunday. Some monasteries even layered feast days into the logic, assigning unique cipher keys to saints' days or local holy observances. A manuscript from a Burgundian abbey reveals how Pentecost triggered a switch from letter-based codes to numerical ones, where the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit became the new cryptographic framework. What made these rotating codes nearly unbreakable was their deep camouflage in routine. Church authorities expected monastic life to revolve around the liturgical year, its fasts, feasts, and commemorations. That a scribe might write differently during Advent than in ordinary time aroused no suspicion. It was precisely how devout practice should appear. This allowed monks to hide in the open, their shifting cryptographic methods masked by the natural ebb and flow of sacred seasons. A bishop reviewing a series of letters would notice only pious attention to liturgical timing, never realizing that the variations in style actually marked deliberate cryptographic phases. The system's sophistication extended to emergency protocols. Certain high-risk periods, like the approach of a papal legate's visit, could trigger prearranged cipher shifts mid-season. A French Benedictine manual details how the phrase "Maranatha" in a sermon would alert scribes to abandon the current seasonal key and adopt a hidden contingency cipher until the threat passed. Others used natural phenomena tied to dates, like solstice light patterns through stained glass, to synchronize code changes without written instructions that might be intercepted. Surviving examples reveal astonishing adaptability. One Welsh psalter alternates between 3 cipher systems annually: Ogham-derived strokes during the penitential seasons, Greek numeral substitutions for feast days, and Latin acrostics in ordinary time. Another from Bohemia embeds its cipher key in the calendar itself. The number of saints listed for each month dictates that period's encryption method. This fluidity made the seasonal cipher less a single system than a living tradition, evolving with the rhythms it sought to protect. The legacy of these time-locked codes echoes in modern cybersecurity's rotating encryption keys. But beyond technique, they offer a profound metaphor for resistance, that sometimes the best way to guard truth isn't to bury it deep, but to let it move with the seasons' changing form like leaves in autumn, always alive beneath the surface. Those medieval cryptographers understood that censorship, for all its power, rarely thinks to question the turning of the year. By binding their secrets to time's eternal cycles, they ensured their words could outweigh any persecution. The dialogue disguise turned theological debate into a literary masquerade, where truth wore the mask of fiction to dance past the watchful eyes of censors. Imagine a monk composing what appears to be a harmless philosophical discussion between a pious abbot and a curious pilgrim, the sort of edifying exchange common in monastic libraries. But woven between the lines of courteous debate, the pilgrim voices dangerous questions about papal authority, while the abbot counters with orthodox replies just strong enough to maintain plausible deniability. This wasn't just storytelling, it was intellectual judo, using the Church's own love of dialectic reasoning as cover for radical thought. What made these fictional dialogues so effective was their roots in legitimate tradition. Since antiquity, philosophers from Plato to Augustine had used dialogue form to explore complex ideas. By adopting this respected format, monks could claim they were merely continuing an honored intellectual practice, never mind that their imaginary skeptics happened to articulate the very heresies being purged beyond monastery walls. A 12th century manuscript from Chartres features a conversation where a Saracen scholar questions transubstantiation, a potentially fatal topic to address directly. Yet the text survived because it framed the controversy as an outsider's honest curiosity rather than the author's personal challenge. The technique's brilliance lay in its layered audience targeting. Superficial readers would see only conventional debate, while initiates recognized specific phrasing as signals to read between the lines. Some dialogues included subtle markers, perhaps an unusual number of speakers corresponding to parentheses, or character names whose initials spelled out forbidden concepts when read in order. A particularly cunning example from a Rhineland abbey presents 7 travelers debating theology at an inn. To casual observers, it's pious entertainment, but those who note that the 7th speaker always delivers the most radical arguments understand this as a coded reference to the 7th Ecumenical Council's contested rulings. Plausible deniability reached its zenith in these texts. When confronted, authors could insist they were merely recording hypothetical discussions or even warning against heresy by showing how to refute it. One Carthusian monk, accused of promoting Waldensian views in his dialogues, famously defended himself by arguing, "Does the playwright who stages a villain become that villain? I record error only to better illuminate truth." The strategy worked. His manuscripts were preserved while outright Waldensian texts burned. Yet the dialogue's greatest power was its ability to smuggle in multiple perspectives. Unlike straightforward treatises that presented a single authoritative voice, these fictional exchanges allowed forbidden ideas to breathe and develop dramatic weight. Readers might find themselves unwittingly persuaded by the heretic character's compelling logic before the orthodox rebuttal arrived, if it arrived at all. Some dialogues ended abruptly with the skeptic's arguments unanswered, leaving the subversion lingering in the reader's mind like the unresolved chord in a Gregorian chant. The legacy of this narrative encryption endures wherever censorship forces ideas underground. From Enlightenment philosophers penning letters from a foreign observer to modern satirists using fictional personas to critique power, the principles remain unchanged. Those medieval monks grasped a timeless truth that sometimes the safest way to speak danger is to let it wear another's voice, and the most effective rebellion might look like nothing more than polite conversation. The celestial cipher turned the night sky into a sprawling codebook, where constellations dictated secret alphabets and planetary motions scrambled messages like divine encryption keys. Imagine a Benedictine monk in a drafty tower, quill in one hand and an astrolabe in the other, carefully noting Jupiter's position before penning a seemingly innocuous letter to a fellow scholar. To the uninitiated, the text praises the harvest, but for those who knew to cross-reference the date with that evening star chart, the same words transformed, each vowel shifting according to Mars's quadrant, each consonant's value determined by the phase of the moon. This wasn't just cryptography, it was cosmic subterfuge weaving celestial mechanics into the fabric of clandestine communication. What set this system apart was its fluid complexity. Unlike static ciphers vulnerable to prolonged scrutiny, the celestial cipher mutated with the heavens themselves. A message composed during a solar eclipse might transpose every third letter with its opposite in the alphabet, while one written under Orion's ascendancy could replace nouns with numerical values based on their astrological correspondences. Some monastic networks synchronized their codes to the Julian calendar's golden numbers, those 19-year cycles used to calculate Easter, ensuring the cipher rules reset before authorities could decipher the pattern. A surviving almanac from a Catalan monastery reveals how scribes used the Saros cycle of lunar eclipses to schedule their most sensitive correspondence, knowing the 18-year gap between identical celestial events would outlast any inquisitor's patience. The system's brilliance lay in its seamless integration of science and spirituality. Medieval monasteries were among the few institutions preserving astronomical knowledge, with monks routinely tracking planets to determine feast days and tide tables. That a star chart might double as a cipher key aroused no suspicion. It was simply pious scholarship. One daring example from a Bohemian scriptorium shows a beautifully illuminated zodiac wheel where the decorative rays between signs actually mark letter substitutions. To the church inspectors who admired it, the page was a masterpiece of devotional art. To initiates, it was a living cipher that changed monthly as the sun entered new constellations. Practical applications ranged from poetic to perilous. Some astrologer monks encoded warnings about approaching persecutions in weather predictions, where Mars conjoining Saturn might signal raids rather than storms. Others hid coordinates to secret libraries within eclipse diagrams, knowing only fellow astronomers would think to decode them. The most elaborate systems even incorporated solar flares, recorded as unusual heavenly fires in observation logs, as natural randomizers to further scramble letter sequences. A French Benedictine star journal from the 13th century contains what appear to be routine planetary observations until cross-referenced with the abbey's construction records. The dates of notable celestial events perfectly match the nights when banned Aristotelian texts were smuggled into the catacombs beneath the chapel. Yet the celestial cipher's true legacy may be its philosophical daring. By binding their secrets to the motions of the cosmos, these monk astronomers made a profound statement. That truth, like the stars, follows patterns beyond human control. No edict could halt Jupiter's march across the sky or prevent Venus from rising as the morning star. Their codes whispered that knowledge, once aligned with the universe's immutable laws, could never be fully contained by earthly powers. In an age when the Church sought to fix dogma like constellations in crystal spheres, these scribes found freedom in the very celestial mechanics they were tasked with calculating, proving that sometimes the best place to hide rebellion is in the infinite vastness overhead. Even the humblest monastery kitchen became a hub of clandestine communication when monks weaponized recipes as cryptographic tools. The culinary code transformed mundane meal preparations into ingenious message vectors, where a scribe's notation for 2 pounds of salt, 1 bushel of lentils, might secretly reference the Book of Two's first chapter, a veiled alert about visiting inspectors. This system thrived on the unassuming nature of domestic records, while theological manuscripts faced scrutiny, who would suspect a soup recipe of harboring heresy. At its core, the technique exploited medieval cooking's precise measurements. Monks adapted the numerical nature of recipes' quantities, ratios, cooking durations into a flexible cipher system. A Bavarian abbey's bread-making instructions from the 14th century survive as a masterclass in this deception. The listed 7 cups of flour, 12 of water, corresponded to Matthew 7:12, a verse about false prophets that initiates recognized as warning about an untrustworthy bishop's impending visit. Other examples show spice inventories doubling as alphabetical guides, where cinnamon's position indicated which letters to extract from adjacent pantry lists. The more routine the document appeared, the more effective it became. Censors were far more likely to burn a controversial sermon than a ledger tracking turnip harvests. But the culinary code's true brilliance lay in its adaptability across monastic cultures. Italian abbeys hiding Waldensian texts might encode locations in wine cellar records, using vintage years as cipher keys. French Cistercians developed a system where roasting times corresponded to biblical verses. A leg of lamb needing 40 minutes signaled Psalm 40's plea for deliverance to sympathetic readers. One particularly audacious example from Catalonia disguises coordinates to a hidden library within a fish stew recipe, where the instructions to simmer for 3 days and nights mark the distance 3 furlongs and direction south, symbolized by the dish's traditional Sabbath preparation. The kitchen environment itself enhanced security. Unlike scriptoriums where strangers might linger over manuscripts, monastic kitchens were intimate spaces where trusted brothers worked shoulder to shoulder. A cook could whisper decryption clues while kneading dough, or use oven temperatures visible only to those present as cipher modifiers. Physical gestures added another layer. Tracing a circle in spilled flour might indicate the message should be read cyclically, while cracking eggs in a specific rhythm could signify inverted alphabetical order. Surviving examples reveal astonishing creativity. A Normandy abbey's instructions for Lenten fasting actually encodes a Neoplatonist treatise using vowel counts per ingredient. Another from Tuscany hides musical notation in a cheese aging log, where mold growth stages correspond to musical rests. The most sophisticated systems even accounted for seasonal ingredient changes, ensuring a spring herb pie and winter root stew could carry consistent cipher rules despite differing components. This edible encryption left a lasting legacy beyond monastery walls. Renaissance apothecaries later adapted the system, hiding contraceptive recipes in seemingly innocent cough syrup instructions. Modern researchers have even identified echoes in World War Roman II resistance movements, where French bakers used bread order forms to coordinate prisoner escapes. The monks who first stirred cryptography into their cookpots understood a fundamental truth: that survival sometimes depends on making the extraordinary indistinguishable from the everyday, where the most potent secrets hide not behind locked doors, but in the scent of rising bread and the rhythmic chop of knives on cutting boards. Stone and sunlight became unlikely conspirators in monasteries where architecture itself whispered secrets. Beyond carved altars and vaulted ceilings, these sacred spaces hid a silent language of angles and alignments, a code written not on parchment, but in the very bones of the buildings. Take the Cistercian Abbey of Fontenay in Burgundy, where a seemingly decorative rose window aligns with the summer solstice sun to cast a pinpoint beam of light onto a single floor tile. To pilgrims, it's a celestial marvel. To initiates, that illuminated tile marks the entrance to an underground scriptorium where banned texts were copied by candlelight. This was encryption on a monumental scale where the sun itself acted as a celestial key. The genius of these architectural codes lay in their permanence and plausibility. While manuscripts could be burned and ciphers forgotten, stone endured. A suspicious abbot might tear apart a monk's cell searching for hidden writings, but he'd hardly dismantle a chapel because its buttresses were spaced at irregular intervals, spacing that, when measured, revealed the exact dimensions of a concealed wall niche. Some designs employed sacred geometry as camouflage, the same golden ratios that symbolized divine perfection in cathedral construction also calculated the positions of secret compartments. A Benedictine chapel in Saxony hides a cavity behind its altar, accessible only by pressing specific carved leaves in the choir stalls, leaves arranged according to the Fibonacci sequence that church architects openly celebrated. Seasonal markers added another layer of sophistication. Certain monasteries designed their cloisters so that shadows formed distinct patterns on feast days, pointing to hidden repositories. At Monte Cassino, the winter solstice sunlight passes through a slit in the western wall to illuminate a carved lamb on the opposite side, a signal to retrieve texts hidden beneath the chapter house floor. Others used water as their medium. The Cistercians of Clairvaux engineered their famous drainage system to produce audible tones when certain channels were opened, creating a liquid Morse code that echoed through the stones. But the most daring systems turned entire buildings into sundial-like encryption devices. The Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela contains a labyrinthine floor pattern where the noonday sun casts a shadow that aligns with hidden letters on certain saints' days. A monk could stand at the center, trace the shadow's path along the stones, and read words written centuries earlier in sunlight and stone. These weren't just hiding places, they were celestial calendars frozen in architecture, ensuring messages could only be decoded at precise moments when heaven and earth aligned. The legacy of these architectural ciphers endures in plain sight. Modern archaeologists using laser scanning have discovered cavities behind abbey walls that match medieval descriptions of the library that walks with the sun. Conservationists restoring a Swiss monastery's frescoes uncovered faint pigment lines extending from murals to floor cracks, a trail of breadcrumbs leading to walled-up book chambers. The monks who crafted these stone puzzles understood something profound, that the surest way to preserve truth isn't just to hide it, but to weave it into the fabric of the world itself, where it waits, patient as cathedral stone, for the right light to reveal it again. The Deathbed Confession cipher represents the most fragile, and in some ways most secure of all monastic secret languages. Unlike ink on parchment or knots in cord, this system existed solely in the space between one dying breath and the next, a whisper passed from failing lips to a successor's ear in the candlelit hush of the infirmary. Picture an elderly monk gripping his protégé's hand, his final words not prayers for salvation, but coordinates to a buried manuscript or the true name of a persecuted scholar, information too volatile to risk writing down, yet too precious to let vanish. This was cryptography stripped to its essence. No tools, no keys, just the human voice and memory carrying truth across generations like a fragile flame in the wind. What made these oral traditions so formidable was their complete immunity to physical search. Church authorities could ransack a monastery from cellar to spire, burning every suspicious text, yet never touch the knowledge preserved in the minds of the initiated. A Cistercian chronicle from Provence describes how an entire lineage of reformist thought survived for 80 years through 12 successive deathbed transmissions, each keeper adding their own insights before passing the chain onward. The system's security lay in its exclusivity. Unlike written codes that could be cracked given enough time, these confessions required personal trust forged over decades of shared monastic life. The training behind this memory work was astonishingly rigorous. Novices destined to receive the oral tradition underwent years of mnemonic conditioning, learning to store information in elaborate mental architectures. Some monasteries adapted classical memory palace techniques, associating each secret with vivid images placed along familiar routes through the cloister. A Benedictine manual from the 15th century details how initiates visualized walking from the chapel to the scriptorium, with each doorway and archway holding a different piece of classified knowledge. Others used rhythmic patterns, setting sensitive data to melodies or verse structures that made recall as natural as singing a hymn. Yet the true artistry lay in the confession rituals themselves. Certain abbeys developed elaborate verification systems where multiple elders would test a deathbed recipient months later, ensuring perfect retention. A Bavarian account describes how 3 retired abbots would suddenly quiz the chosen successor during unrelated tasks, asking for "that verse we discussed last winter" while washing dishes or mending robes. Failure meant demotion from the chain. Perfection earned the right to someday whisper the secrets forward. Some orders even employed counterintuitive tactics, deliberately mixing false information into early transmissions to weed out those with imperfect recall before entrusting them with core truths. The content of these confessions ranged from practical to profound. Some preserved the locations of hidden libraries, like the famed case of a Clairvaux monk who used his last breaths to describe a cache behind a waterfall, leading to the rediscovery of long-lost Ciceronian texts centuries later. Others guarded explosive historical truths, like the rumored deathbed revelation that kept the identity of a papal assassin secret for 200 years. Most poignant were the theological secrets, alternate translations of scripture, suppressed gospels, or philosophical arguments too radical to commit to parchment. A fragmentary diary from a Portuguese monastery suggests some dying monks didn't just transmit information, but entire methods of interpretation, teaching successors how to read between the lines of approved texts to extract forbidden meanings. This tradition's legacy is both everywhere and nowhere in the historical record. Unlike ciphers that left physical traces, the deathbed confessions survive only as shadows, hints in monastery ledgers about special instructions given to certain monks on their death watches, or sudden appearances of knowledge that had no documented transmission path. Modern scholars debate whether some controversial medieval texts resurfacing after centuries of absence might represent the rare moments when an oral chain finally felt safe to write down. The ultimate irony, these most ephemeral of codes may have preserved truths longer than any parchment, precisely because they left nothing for censors to burn. The final lesson of the deathbed cipher is one of radical trust in human connection. In an age when we encrypt data with quantum algorithms and multi-factor authentication, those medieval monks remind us that some truths need no technology to endure, just one steady voice in the dark, one listening ear, and the unbroken chain of memory stretching further than any parchment could hope to last. Centuries before firewalls and end-to-end encryption, medieval monks were already wrestling with the same fundamental questions that define our digital age: who gets to control knowledge? How do we protect truth from those who would suppress it? Their 25 ingenious language systems weren't just historical curiosities. They were blueprints for a struggle that spans human history. Consider the parallels. Just as modern encryption shields our emails from prying eyes, the monks' wax tablets and mirror scripts created ephemeral spaces where ideas could breathe freely, if only for a moment. Their liturgical codes, tied to celestial events and seasonal rhythms, anticipated today's rotating security keys by nearly a millennium. Even their use of dialect as camouflage finds echoes in contemporary privacy tools that mask digital traffic as mundane data. What's truly astonishing is how these medieval techniques foreshadowed specific modern cryptographic principles. The Caesar Shift letter substitution mirrors the basic logic of today's substitution ciphers, while the book cipher's use of shared text as keys operates on the same principle as modern one-time pads. The grid cipher's overlay system is essentially a physical version of steganography software that hides messages in image files. Even the deathbed confession cipher, with its oral transmission chain, functions like a biological version of secure ephemeral messaging information that exists only in memory, leaving no forensic trail. These weren't just random acts of secrecy, they were systematic explorations of information theory centuries before Claude Shannon formalized the field. Yet the monk's greatest legacy isn't just technical, it's philosophical. In an era when knowledge was power and power was concentrated in very few hands, they demonstrated that creativity could outmaneuver brute force. Their systems exploited the blind spots of authority, the assumption that marginalia was trivial, that recipes were harmless, that stone couldn't speak. Today's privacy advocates face similar asymmetrical battles against surveillance states and data monopolies, and the monastic playbook still offers potent strategies. Like those scribes who hid rebellion in psalters, modern activists embed subversion in memes, use gaming platforms to organize, and leverage encryption tools built by idealistic programmers, all proving that censorship's greatest weakness is its inability to anticipate imagination. The most poignant lesson, though, lies in their understanding of resilience. These cryptographic systems weren't designed for permanent victory, but for persistence, to keep ideas alive long enough to reach kinder times. Manuscripts buried in walls, oral traditions passed through generations, messages tied to the star's inevitability, all recognize that truth doesn't always need to win outright, just endure. In our age of digital fragility where tweets vanish and servers get wiped, the monks' commitment to multi-generational preservation feels almost radical. Their encryption wasn't just about hiding, it was about remembering, ensuring that no matter how dark the night, someone would always hold the keys to dawn. Perhaps that's why these ancient codes still resonate. They remind us that encryption isn't just mathematics, it's the human spirit's refusal to be silenced. Whether carved in stone, whispered in a dying breath, or flashed across fiber optic cables, the impulse remains the same: to carve out spaces where truth can wait, unbroken, for its moment to shine. The monks didn't just invent secret languages, they forged an unbroken chain of defiance that stretches from parchment to pixels, proving that while technologies change, the right to whisper back at power is timeless. From Caesar Shift to celestial ciphers, these secret languages showcase the brilliance and bravery of monks who risked everything to safeguard ideas. Their methods remind us that censorship often fuels innovation, as necessity births ingenious solutions. Think about it: when authority burned books, monks hid words in candle wax. When inspectors scrutinized every letter, they turned to constellations and cooking recipes. Even the architecture of their monasteries became a living cipher, with sunlight and shadow pointing the way to hidden knowledge. This wasn't just survival, it was a masterclass in creative resistance, proving that the human mind will always find cracks in the walls built to contain it. What's truly remarkable is how these medieval techniques echo in our digital age. The monks' wax tablets, designed to vanish at a moment's notice, mirror today's self-destructing messages. Their celestial ciphers, tied to the unpredictable movements of planets, foreshadowed modern encryption keys that change with each use. Even their deathbed whispers, oral traditions passed from one keeper to the next, find parallels in secure ephemeral messaging apps that leave no trace. The tools have evolved, but the game remains the same, outsmarting power by staying one step ahead of its grasp. Yet beyond the technical parallels, there's a deeper lesson here about the nature of forbidden knowledge. The monks didn't just hide texts, they weaponized the ordinary, transforming soup recipes, hymn lyrics, and even the knots in their robes into vehicles for truth. Their greatest innovation wasn't any single cipher, but the realization that secrecy thrives best when disguised as mundanity. In an era of mass surveillance and algorithmic censorship, that's a playbook worth remembering. Sometimes the most radical act isn't shouting into the void, but hiding your message in plain sight, where only those who truly need it will think to look. So which of these cryptographic systems resonates with you? Maybe it's the poetic rebellion of acrostic psalms, where faith and defiance shared the same page. Or perhaps the culinary code speaks to you, a reminder that revolution can simmer in the most unexpected places. Whatever captures your imagination, let us know in the comments below. And if you've enjoyed this journey through history's hidden languages, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the past's unsung innovations. Until next time, take a page from the monastic playbook, guard your truths well, but never stop sharing them cleverly, courageously, and always one step ahead of the gate.